Imagine standing in the most magnificent city on earth, a place where scholars from every corner of the known world gathered to unlock the secrets of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Picture libraries so vast that their collections could fill entire palaces, streets lined with merchants selling silk and spices from distant lands, and architectural wonders that made European cities look like villages in comparison. Now, imagine watching all of it burn. Every building reduced to ash. Every book thrown into the river until the water runs black with ink. Every scholar, every child, every soul you've ever known cut down in the streets while you stand powerless to stop it. And then imagine that this nightmare is only the beginning of what awaits you and your family. This was February 1258 in Baghdad, the year the Mongol Empire came to the jewel of the Islamic world. The year Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, brought an army so massive that it required 1 in every 10 fighting men from across the entire Mongol Empire. And the year that Caliph Al-Musta'sim learned that royal blood and divine authority meant nothing when faced with an enemy who recognized neither. What happened to the Caliph himself was brutal enough, but what the Mongols did to his family, to his sons and his daughter, was something that haunted the Islamic world for generations and remains one of history's darkest footnotes. For half a millennium, Baghdad had stood as the beating heart of Islamic civilization. Founded in 762 by Caliph Al-Mansur, the city had grown into what historians call the intellectual capital of the planet. The House of Wisdom, Baghdad's legendary library, contained knowledge gathered from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese sources. Here, scholars translated ancient texts, advanced algebra, refined astronomical models, and pioneered medical procedures that Europe wouldn't discover for centuries. During its golden age between the years 1000 and 1200, Baghdad stood among the world's largest cities, joined only by Chinese metropolises like Kaifeng and Hangzhou in having populations exceeding 1 million. By the time of the Mongol siege, estimates suggest the population ranged between 300,000 and 1 million inhabitants. No European city of that era came close to matching its size or sophistication. The Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled from Baghdad, had once controlled an empire stretching from North Africa to Central Asia. By 1258, that empire had fractured into competing dynasties and regional powers. The caliph's actual political authority extended little beyond Baghdad itself and the surrounding territories, yet the office still carried immense symbolic weight. The caliph was the successor to the Prophet Muhammad's legacy, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, the figure who conferred legitimacy upon sultans and emirs across the Muslim world. Even the mighty Seljuk Turks, who had conquered Baghdad centuries earlier, had allowed the caliphs to maintain their position precisely because of this religious authority. The caliph didn't need armies when his blessing could make or break a dynasty. This was the miscalculation that would doom Al-Musta'sim and everyone he loved. When the Mongol threat materialized on his borders, the caliph treated it as he had treated other challenges, with diplomatic maneuvering, religious posturing, and the assumption that his sacred office would somehow shield him. He had no idea he was dealing with an empire that had already conquered half of Eurasia and wasn't particularly concerned about Islamic religious authority. Hulagu Khan arrived in Persia in 1256 with explicit orders from his brother, the great Khan Mongke. Those orders were straightforward. Destroy the Nizari Ismaili assassins, subjugate or destroy the Abbasid Caliphate, conquer Syria, and if possible, take Egypt. Mongke had assembled the largest Mongol army ever fielded for this campaign. By his decree, 2 out of every 10 warriors in the entire empire were conscripted for Hulagu's force. The army that marched westward numbered over 138,000 men. They brought Chinese siege engineers, Armenian cavalry, Georgian auxiliary forces, and enough supplies to sustain a campaign lasting years. The assassins fell in 1256. Their mountain fortress at Alamut, long considered impregnable, was systematically dismantled. Next came Baghdad. Hulagu sent messengers to Al-Musta'sim with a clear demand: submit to Mongol authority, provide military support, and open your gates. The alternative was destruction. Historical records preserve the remarkable exchange of letters between the two leaders. Al-Musta'sim's response dripped with contempt. He called Hulagu young and ignorant, boasted that he could summon armies from across the Islamic world, and suggested that the Mongols turn back while they still could. Hulagu's reply was equally memorable. "I will bring you crashing down from the summit of the sky. Like a lion, I will throw you down to the lowest depths. I will not leave a single person alive in your country. I will turn your city, lands, and empire into flames." Neither rhetoric nor religious authority would save Baghdad. The Caliph failed to strengthen the city's walls, failed to stockpile adequate supplies, and most critically, failed to gather a proper army. He disbanded much of his military force, apparently believing that the Mongols wouldn't dare attack the holiest city in Sunni Islam. Meanwhile, other Muslim powers that might have come to his aid were dealing with their own crises. The Mamluks in Egypt were hostile toward him. The Ayyubids in Syria were fighting for their own survival. Al-Musta'sim had miscalculated catastrophically, and by the time he realized it, the Mongol forces were already at his gates. The siege began on January 29, 1258. Hulagu divided his forces to threaten both banks of the Tigris River simultaneously. Earlier, on January 17th, the Caliph had sent out a sortie of 20,000 cavalry to engage the Mongols in open battle. Hulagu's forces executed a devastating tactic, breaking the dikes along the Dujail Canal and flooding the ground behind the Abbasid army, trapping them between the rising water and Mongol warriors. Most of those 20,000 men drowned or were slaughtered. The survivors fled back to Baghdad with news that shattered any remaining hope. The Mongols brought siege engines and catapults designed by Chinese engineers who had perfected the art of breaking fortifications. Baghdad's walls, inadequately maintained and defended by a demoralized garrison of approximately 30,000 troops, stood no chance. By February 5th, less than a week into the siege, Mongol forces controlled a significant stretch of the eastern wall. Al-Musta'sim frantically attempted to negotiate, offering tribute, promising obedience, desperately seeking any terms that might spare his city. Hulagu refused. He had not assembled the largest army in Mongol history to accept half measures. He wanted total surrender, complete submission, and an example that would echo across the entire region. On February 10th, the Caliph walked out of his city to meet Hulagu personally. He brought with him 3,000 of Baghdad's most prominent citizens, dignitaries, scholars, and officials, believing perhaps that this show of cooperation might save lives. It was a final, tragic miscalculation. Hulagu ordered them all executed on the spot. The Caliph himself was spared for the moment, but only so he could witness what came next. 3 days later, on February 13th, the Mongol army swept into Baghdad like a tide of destruction. What followed was a week of slaughter that ranks among the bloodiest episodes in human history. The exact death toll remains debated, with contemporary estimates ranging from as low as 90,000 to as high as 1 million people. Hulagu himself later claimed approximately 200,000 dead, though the true number may have been amplified by epidemics that followed the massacre. What isn't disputed is the systematic nature of the destruction. Mongol soldiers went street by street, building by building. They killed scholars, merchants, artisans, women, children, and the elderly. Only the Christian community was largely spared, thanks to the intervention of Hulagu's wife, Dokuz Khatun, a devout Nestorian Christian who insisted that Baghdad's churches and Christian population be protected. Everyone else faced the sword. The House of Wisdom, that legendary repository of human knowledge, was destroyed. Soldiers threw countless manuscripts into the Tigris River. Medieval chroniclers reported that the water ran black with ink from the dissolved pages and red with blood from the slaughtered. Whether this description was literal or symbolic, It captured the magnitude of cultural devastation. Mosques were burned, palaces were looted and demolished, libraries, hospitals, schools, and observatories, buildings that had taken generations to construct and represent centuries of accumulated learning, were reduced to rubble. Medieval chroniclers reported that books were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water reportedly ran black with ink and red with blood. Though whether this description was literal or served as a powerful metaphor for the magnitude of destruction remains debated by historians. The stench of death grew so overpowering that Hulagu had to move his camp upwind of the city just to escape the smell of decomposing bodies. Baghdad, the city that had been one of the wonders of the medieval world, became a charnel house. Through all of this, Al-Musta'sim was kept alive. The Mongols forced him to watch as his city burned and his subjects died. Multiple historical accounts describe Hulagu bringing the Caliph to his vast treasure room, the chamber where Al-Musta'sim had hoarded gold and jewels rather than spending them on defense or paying his soldiers adequately. The Persian scholar Nasir al-Din Tusi, who witnessed these events while serving as an advisor to Hulagu, recorded the exchange that followed. According to Tusi's account, Hulagu placed a golden plate before the Caliph and commanded him to eat. When Al-Musta'sim replied that gold wasn't edible, Hulagu reportedly responded with devastating logic. Then why did you keep it instead of giving it to your soldiers? Why didn't you melt down these iron doors and make arrowheads? Why didn't you come to the riverbank to stop me from crossing? The Caliph, defeated and broken, could only murmur that such was God's will. Hulagu's reply was chilling. What will befall you is also God's will. Marco Polo, writing decades later, claimed that Hulagu locked Al-Musta'sim in his treasure room without food or water, forcing him to starve to death, surrounded by useless wealth, while being told to eat of thy treasure as much as thou wilt, since thou art so fond of it. This dramatic story appears to be a later embellishment that conflated Tusi's account of the treasure room confrontation with the Caliph's actual execution. Most contemporary accounts agree on a different method of execution, one rooted in Mongol religious beliefs and customs. On February 20th, 10 days after surrendering his city, Al-Musta'sim was executed. The Mongols followed a strict taboo against spilling royal blood directly onto the earth. They believed that allowing royal blood to touch the ground would offend the earth itself and bring catastrophe. When executing princes or kings, they employed methods that avoided this pollution. The most common technique was trampling. Multiple sources, both Persian and Mongol, describe what happened to the last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad. He was wrapped tightly in a carpet or placed in a felt sack. Then, Mongol horsemen rode over him repeatedly until he was crushed to death. The carpet prevented his blood from touching the ground. The method was brutal, but considered respectful within Mongol tradition. It was the same technique they had used to execute the Mongol aristocrat Jamuka decades earlier, a death considered noble in their eyes because the blood remained concealed. For Al-Musta'sim, death might have been a mercy compared to what he had already endured. But his death wasn't the end of the suffering. The fate of his family reveals the true depths of Mongol conquest and the specific horrors reserved for royal bloodlines. Most of the Caliph's sons were massacred alongside their father. The exact number remains unclear, but multiple sources confirm that several princes of the Abbasid line were executed in the days following the city's fall. The Mongols were systematic about eliminating rival claimants to power. Any son old enough to potentially lead a resistance or rally support had to die. Some historical accounts mention that the eldest son, whose name is recorded as Ahmed in certain sources, may have been killed at the Kalwath Gate, though the specific circumstances vary across different chronicles. But not all of Al-Musta'sim's children died. One son survived, though his fate was arguably worse than a quick death. Abul Abbas Ahmad was sent to Mongolia as a prisoner. Thousands of miles from his homeland, stripped of his title, authority, and any connection to his former identity, he lived out his days in captivity. Mongolian historical records indicate that he eventually married and fathered children, including a daughter named Aisha and a son named Rukn al-Din Ahmad. His descendants, according to these sources, lived on in Mongolia. but played absolutely no role in Islam thereafter. The bloodline continued, but the legacy, the purpose, the meaning of being an Abbasid prince, all of that was severed completely. For a dynasty that had defined itself by religious authority and spiritual leadership for 5 centuries, this erasure of identity and purpose represented a death of everything that mattered, even while biological life continued. But the cruelest fate was reserved for at least one of Al-Musta'sim's daughters. According to historical sources documenting the immediate family of the Caliph, a daughter was taken as a slave into Hulagu Khan's harem. The specifics regarding her name, age, or the details of her life before the conquest remain lost to history. This absence itself speaks volumes about how medieval chroniclers viewed women, even princesses. To understand what this meant, we need to grasp the reality of the Mongol harem system and the specific circumstances of a captive princess. The Mongol Khans maintained extensive harems filled with women from conquered territories. This wasn't simply about desire or pleasure. It was a deliberate policy of domination and political calculation. Taking the daughters and wives of defeated rulers served multiple purposes. It humiliated the conquered, prevented those women from bearing children who might claim legitimacy to challenge Mongol rule, and demonstrated Mongol supremacy over the most protected and valued members of enemy societies. For an Abbasid princess, if indeed one was taken as the limited sources suggest, this would have represented a fall from the highest imaginable status to the lowest. Raised in the secluded world of the Caliphal harem, where she would have been treated with reverence as a daughter of the commander of the faithful, she would have been attended by servants, educated by the finest tutors available, and protected by centuries of Islamic tradition regarding the treatment of noble women. In Hulagu's harem, based on what we know of Mongol practices, she would have been one concubine among many, with no special privileges, no protection, and no hope of escape or rescue. The psychological horror of this transformation, if it occurred as some sources indicate, cannot be overstated. She likely witnessed the destruction of everything she had ever known. Her city burned, her family massacred, her entire world annihilated. And then, instead of death, she was claimed as spoils of war. The very fact of her survival in this scenario would have become its own form of torment. Every day she lived would have been a reminder that her life had been considered so insignificant, so valueless in terms of political threat, that the Mongols hadn't even bothered to kill her. She was simply absorbed into the conqueror's household, one more possession among thousands. The historical record provides no clear answers about what became of her. We don't know with certainty how long she lived, whether she bore children, or what her ultimate fate was. We don't know if she eventually converted to Christianity, as Hulagu's principal wife Doku's Khatun was Christian and held significant influence in the court. We don't know if she ever saw another member of her family, ever heard Arabic spoken with the Baghdad dialect, or ever experienced a moment of the dignity she was born to expect. The sources largely go silent about the individual stories of women taken from Baghdad's elite, which is itself revealing. For those who experienced this fate, they cease to matter as individuals in the historical record. Their identities as Abbasid princesses or noblewomen erased as thoroughly as Baghdad's libraries. Historical accounts mention that other women from Baghdad's elite suffered similar fates. The medieval chronicler Abdullah Wasaf, writing decades after the events, described in general terms how women from the great households of the city were subjected to systematic degradation during and after the siege. Whether the specific detail about the caliph's daughter being taken as a concubine represents confirmed historical fact, or represents a pattern that befell many noble women of Baghdad, including potentially members of the royal family, the broader reality remains clear. The conquest wasn't limited to political and military defeat, but extended to the complete social destruction of Baghdad's ruling class. This was the deliberate cruelty of Mongol conquest. Death was almost merciful compared to the complete annihilation of identity, purpose, and legacy that the survivors endured. The son sent to Mongolia lived but lost his religion, his culture, and his entire reason for existing as an Abbasid prince. For any daughter or daughters who survived in captivity, if the accounts suggesting this are accurate, they would have faced the loss of dignity, status, and personhood. They remained biologically alive while everything that made them who they were was systematically destroyed. The sack of Baghdad sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world that reverberate to this day. Many historians mark February 1258 as the end of the Islamic Golden Age. The center of Islamic scholarship and political power shifted westward to Cairo under the Mamluks, who managed to defeat the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, stopping their advance. The Mamluks even appointed shadow Abbasid Caliphs in Cairo to maintain some semblance of continuity, but these figures were purely symbolic, holding no real power. Baghdad itself took centuries to recover. The irrigation systems that had sustained Mesopotamian agriculture for millennia were destroyed and never fully rebuilt. The population plummeted. The great institutions of learning vanished. The city that had once rivaled Constantinople and surpassed any European capital became a provincial backwater. Hulagu appointed a Persian governor to rebuild, and some recovery occurred, but Baghdad would never again reach its former glory. The fate of the Abbasid royal family served as a warning that echoed for generations. It demonstrated that no amount of religious authority, cultural achievement, or historical prestige could protect you from an enemy with superior military force and the will to use it utterly. It showed that sometimes surviving the conquest was worse than dying in it. And it revealed that the greatest cruelty wasn't necessarily death, but the systematic erasure of everything that gave life meaning. When we remember the fall of Baghdad, we tend to focus on the books burned, the scholars killed, the architectural wonders destroyed. These losses were indeed catastrophic for human civilization. But we should also remember the individuals whose names we often don't even know with certainty, like those members of the royal family who faced fates that historical sources only hint at or describe in frustratingly vague terms. We should remember the son exiled to Mongolia, living on but disconnected from his purpose. We should remember that conquest doesn't just destroy cities and cultures. It destroys families, identities, and the very sense of who people understood themselves to be. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad and its royal family represents one of history's darkest chapters, not because of the death toll alone, though that was staggering, but because of the calculated nature of the suffering inflicted. The Mongols understood that some fates are worse than death. They understood that forcing the Caliph to watch his city burn before executing him created more terror than simply killing him in battle. They understood that taking his daughter as a concubine served as a more complete victory than leaving no survivors at all. This was conquest as annihilation, not just of political structures, but of human dignity itself. In February 1258, the intellectual capital of the world burned. The heir to the prophet's legacy was rolled in a carpet and trampled beneath horses' hooves. And members of the royal family, including at least one son sent to distant Mongolia and possibly daughters taken into the conqueror's household, faced fates that the historical sources struggle to fully document. These weren't just historical events. They were human tragedies, personal nightmares, and fates worse than death itself. If this deep dive into one of history's darkest moments fascinated you, hit that like button and subscribe to The Codex of History. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people, their suffering, their choices, and the lessons we can learn from their experiences. The past has so much to teach us if we're willing to listen to its darkest chapters as well as its triumphs.